couple of tasks quickly before we introduce our distinguished speaker. The first is just to mention quickly that you'll notice an insert in your program which is about the James A. Bill Endowment for Study Abroad. And we wanted to make sure you all saw that because we are continuing to raise funds in Jim's honor for that scholarship. As you heard the provost say this morning, one of Jim's fondest wishes was that every student at William & Mary who wanted to study abroad would have the opportunity to do so. So if you do have an interest in doing that, it has instructions there about how you might help us with that cause and honor Jim in that way. I also want to say a few words about the Kramer Scholar in Residence program, which is helping to fund this lecture and the conference in general. And I want to say a few words about it because it's a little different this year. If you read our website, you'll see that the Kramer Middle East Distinguished Scholar in Residence is offered yearly and provides the opportunity for a scholar specializing in Islamic law or governance to spend a short time at William & Mary sharing his or her expertise with the university community, and that's open to all geographic areas, subdisciplines, et cetera. So short time usually is more than a day. However, we're extremely lucky in this case to have somebody of such renown and the perfect person for this conference, which is Jerry Seib. And we also want to acknowledge the Kramer family and the Kramer Endowment for supporting the entire conference, which obviously is on a theme very close to the Kramer family's intent, and which is something I hope they feel very proud of. I certainly am. So now let me turn to introducing our keynote speaker for the day, Gerald Seib. Jerry Seib is the executive Washington editor and chief commentator from the Wall Street Journal, someone who had close contact with Jim Bill, and he'll talk, I'm sure, more about that. He writes the weekly Capital Journal column for the Journal, which brings an insightful, predictive, and original understanding to politics, national affairs, and foreign policy. And in addition, he writes other periodic analyses of national and international affairs for the newspaper and wallstreetjournal.com, WSJ.com. Jerry oversees the Journal's daily Washington newsletter, Capital Journal Daybreak, and produces daily video analyses of events in the nation's capital. Fortunately, there haven't been any today, so he was able to take the day off. Mr. Seib appears regularly on networks such as CBS, NBC, Fox News, CNN, and the BBC as a commentator on Washington affairs. He also has responsibility for the Wall Street Journal, NBC News polls, and has moderated 3 presidential debates. Prior to taking his current position, he served for 12 years as the Journal's Washington bureau chief and as the Journal's deputy Washington bureau chief before that. He joined the Dallas bureau of the Journal as a reporter in 1978 and then transferred to the Journal's Washington bureau in 1980, covering the Pentagon and the State Department. Then in 1994, he and his wife, Journal reporter Barbara Rosewitz, were transferred to Cairo to cover the Middle East. And so, of course, here's where the connections begin. They returned to the Washington bureau in 1987, covering the White House, diplomacy, and foreign policy. And in December of 1992, Jerry became a news editor responsible for the Journal's national political coverage from Washington and around the country. It's going to take too long to mention all of his distinguished journalism awards. They cover quite a lot of ground. Let me just quickly mention that in 1988, Mr. Seib won the Merriman Smith Award, which honors coverage of the presidency under deadline, and the Aldo Beckman Award for coverage of the White House and the presidency. He's received a Gerald R. Ford Foundation Prize for distinguished reporting on the presidency, and the Weintal Prize from Georgetown University's Institute of Diplomacy for his coverage of the Gulf War. And you get the sense, the list goes on. Mr. Seib earned his bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Kansas, which is where 2 of my brothers went to school, and was also an intern in the Journal's Dallas bureau, there, editor of the university's newspaper, the Daily Kansan. It's a great tradition. And a Sears Foundation congressional intern in the office of U.S. Representative Gilles Long. Gilles? Is it Gilles? Because it's Louisiana. Gilles Long of Louisiana. He and his wife have 3 sons and live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. So it is really an honor, sir, to have you here with us today. We really look forward to your talk, and the talk is entitled, as you see, U.S.-Iran Relations Must It Always Be This Hard? Jerry Seib.
Thank you. You know, I told Steve this morning that, after last night, his sense of timing to have a conference on the Middle East today is just exquisite. I mean, who knew? You knew, obviously. So, area studies, yeah, go for it. It's really remarkable. I think about this. How often in my career I have either gone to bed or woken up to images of missiles flying in the Middle East. It's remarkable and depressing, and here we are again. But anyway, I'm happy to be here and not in Washington today. I will say that, and it's an honor to be here and to be asked to be here. And a little intimidating, I got to say, in a room with this much experience and this much expertise. I don't know what I can tell anyone that they don't already know or know more of than I already do, but I'll give it a try. I'm reminded a little bit of Admiral James Stockdale, Ross Perot's running mate, in 1992 in his independent run for the presidency. And you probably recall he famously started a debate by saying, "Who am I and why am I here?" And then he didn't give a very good answer, by the way. But so you might ask, why am I here? Well, the simple answer, of course, is Jim Bill. That's why I'm here. I began talking to Jim Bill in 1981. I remember it very clearly, because I was a young reporter in Washington. I'd just gotten there, trying to figure out something intelligent to say about Iran. And one of my colleagues from those days, Ron Schaefer, I'm happy to say, is here joining us. He was an editor of mine then. And a colleague of ours was Karen House, who was my colleague covering national security and diplomacy. She had gone to the University of Texas, and she said, if you want to say something intelligent about Iran, there's this smart guy down there. Why don't you call him, educate yourself a little bit? So I called Jim, and indeed, I educated myself by talking to him. And from that time forward, while I worked in Washington, while I was based in the Middle East, and had my own memorable experiences inside Iran, which I'll get to in a few minutes, and on to my career as a columnist, I always knew that Jim Bill was somebody you could count on to have a few intelligent, insightful things to say, and who would always generously and in a quite unique Jim Bill kind of way graciously share those thoughts with you. So that's me and Jim Bill, and I was honored to be asked to come back because of that connection. And as it happens, my career, in a bizarre kind of way, remained intertwined with Iran, and by extension, therefore, with Jim, and it feels like it's a cloud that has followed me for the last 4 decades. My very first day as a member of the Wall Street Journal Washington Bureau, it was literally true, was the day of the Desert One rescue mission, which you'll remember was the mission designed to extract the American hostages from the embassy in Tehran that failed tragically when 2 helicopters ran into each other in the desert. A giant international brouhaha erupted. I remember thinking, wow, this is an interesting place. And also thinking, wow, this relationship with Iran is destined to be nothing but big trouble. And that part certainly turned out to be true. And that's the way it's felt for most of the 37 years since then. I've never been able to escape the Iran story, and maybe I never will. But this isn't really about me. This is about that story, the story of Iran, I think. And maybe my experience of tracking that over the years is just one way of looking at the broader tragically troubled relationship between the U.S. and the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's dogged every president I've covered since, every administration, and a whole host of international initiatives for those 4 decades. It's an arc that defies belief and sometimes defies logic. And it's marked, I think, above all, by tragic mutual cultural misunderstandings between the 2 countries, the very kinds of things that Jim Bill tried to address and to eliminate. And so that leads to the question I will try to address here, which is, does it have to be this way? And I thought that what I would try to do is walk through the arc of this relationship as I happen to have seen it as a journalist both in Washington and in the Middle East, and then try to step back from that and say, what can we learn? Desert One was followed, of course, by the electoral defeat of Jimmy Carter, and those 2 things were closely connected, by the way, and the election of Ronald Reagan. And more than a few people thought the Iranians had essentially defeated Carter and elected Reagan had, in fact, claimed their first president. The Carter defeat was followed by the release of the hostages from Tehran at the very moment Ronald Reagan was sworn in on the steps of the Capitol. And many of us at the time thought that was perhaps a sign that the Iranians actually feared Ronald Reagan, that he might do to them things President Carter was not willing to do to them. And I think in retrospect that was probably wrong. It seems more likely the Iranians were simply using the transition as an excuse to rid themselves of a problem, the hostages, which had become a problem by then, that they couldn't easily dispose of otherwise. Because ultimately, the Iranians challenged Ronald Reagan as well. That challenge came, of course, in Lebanon, and particularly in the bombing of the U.S. Embassy and the Marine barracks at the airport. and President Reagan responded by essentially retreating from Lebanon. The Iranians won, in a sense, and learned something about the potential rewards of continuing to challenge the U.S. But at another level, ironically, the Iranians are still paying a price for that, because some of the people who populate the Trump administration right now trace their views of Iran back to those days in Lebanon and the bad things that happened there, and that particularly includes Jim Mattis, the Marine General Secretary of Defense, who remembers very well what happened at the airport in Beirut. Soon enough, though, it was the Reagan administration courting the Iranians, not confronting them. And this courting, of course, came in the form of the Irancontra scandal, which boiled down to its essence was an attempt to buy Iranian help in getting hostages released in Lebanon by providing the government in Tehran with armaments to help in its war with Iraq. That all backfired, obviously, spectacularly, in the form of the Iran-Contra scandal, which, when revealed in its full measure, almost cost the second president his job. And that's the point where the Iran story got a little personal for me. I transferred from Washington to the Middle East in 1984, along with my wife, Barbara. We became, the two of us, the Middle East Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. It was a great gig. We lived in Cairo. And we covered everything from North Africa through the far end of the Persian Gulf. That area obviously included the country of Iran. The problem was it was impossible to get to Iran. It was something of the forbidden country in those days. Couldn't get a visa, and was known to be slightly dangerous if you did get in. But in 1987, after 2 years of knocking on the door of various Iranian consulates and embassies, I was invited in as part of a group of journalists to cover what was then the last stages of the war with Iraq. So we get to Tehran, we all trundle down to the war front, down near Basra. Trust me, when the Iranians took you to the war front, they took you to the war front. I mean, it was like artillery shells flying overhead, machine gun fire in the near distance. It was the war front, but we spent a night there. The point of the exercise, by the way, was for the Iranians to show that they had moved into Iraqi territory near Basra, and that did, in fact, prove to be one of the final stages of the war, because it was a decisive offensive that we were called in to watch. Spent a night down there in a military bunker filled with maps, made it back to Tehran safely, or so I thought. But instead of going home, the Iranians invited us the next day to go to a press conference. This was the press conference in which then the Parliament Speaker, Rafsanjani, explained what really happened in the Iran-Contra scandal, displayed the Bible he had received from Ronald Reagan, inscribed by Ronald Reagan, described the cake he had received from Oliver North, and spilled the beans about the overtures. And the point really was to say to Iranians first, but then to the world, yes, we dealt with the great American Satan, and we got the better of him. They sent the cake, we got the missiles. Then I thought I would leave, but I couldn't. The Iranian officials escorting me had my passport, and they wouldn't give it back. No explanation. So a Swiss diplomat and I spent the next day driving around from office to office in the foreign ministry and elsewhere, trying to figure out why, and got no answers. So we came back to my hotel for the night. We were in the parking lot of the hotel, a car pulled up alongside, 4 guys in camouflage jumped out, grabbed me, threw me in the back seat of their car. One of them jumped on top of me, put a blindfold on me, slammed the car doors, and tore off down into the streets of Tehran, screaming at me in Persian all the while. And I learned about 10 words of Arabic when I was in the Middle East, but I didn't know any Farsi, so I didn't know what was happening. But eventually we pulled to a stop, and they walked me inside a building. And that building was Evin Prison, the notorious place where political prisoners go in Iran. And I was led into a room where a young Iranian official told me, you are a spy, we know you are a spy, you should just admit it, things will be easier for you. I responded, I'm not a spy, I'm a journalist, your country invited me here, you know who I am, and so that's how it began. 4 days of interrogations, all pursuing the same theme. I was a spy, I was an Israeli spy, I was a Mossad agent, I was an American spy, well, at least I was Jewish, wasn't I? And anyway, that's how it went for 4 days. I spent most of my time in an interrogation room, eventually found my way into a prison cell in Evin Prison, and then on the 5th day, without any explanation, my interrogators came to me and said, your case has been successfully resolved, you are released. I was freed. I still had the blindfold on, which I had on for 4 days. And as we walked to the prison gate, I pulled it off because I thought, I want at least one look at these guys. Turned around, looked at one of my interrogators in the eye, and he extended his hand, and he shook my hand, and he said, do you have a business card? If I get to the U.S., I'd like to come see you. So I gave him my card, and he never called. Anyway, the Journal had won my release by pulling all the levers that you would expect. And why did I get taken? I'll never know. Perhaps I was used as a pawn to settle some internal score. Perhaps, as one Egyptian researcher later told me, I was identified as a suspect character because I had some dealings with Libyan dissidents from my home base in Cairo. I don't know. But whatever the reason, I wrote, as I wrote after my release, that to deal with a government where one branch of the government could invite you in and the other branch could arrest you once you get there was a sign that this was not going to be an easy rapprochement between our two countries. Then life proceeded, not just for me, obviously, but for the two countries. Relations got worse when the U.S. managed to shoot down an Iranian civilian airliner near the end of the Reagan years, an episode that most everybody in this country has forgotten. Ultimately, the war with Iraq ended, and the first Bush administration thought that that might produce the opportunity for a rapprochement, but it discovered a couple of problems stood in the way. One was the deep and lingering suspicion and anger in Tehran over the help the U.S. government provided to Saddam Hussein during that Iran-Iraq war, another factor that I think was then and is now still underappreciated here. And the other was obviously Iran's own muscular embrace of the radical Palestinian movement in the form of Hezbollah and Hamas, and what the Revolutionary Guards started in that period to do with them. And then, of course, as time went on, American attention was consumed by the U.S. war against that same Saddam Hussein after his invasion of Kuwait. And in that war, the U.S. was standing up for the Persian Arab regimes threatened by Saddam Hussein, and in the process was defending the very regional enemies that the Iranians were most worried about. So that wasn't a recipe for reconciliation either, especially because the first Iraq war produced the other thing the Iranians feared most, which was a bigger and lingering U.S. military presence in the region, which only served to exacerbate the fears in Tehran that the U.S. ulterior motive in most things was really to produce regime change in Tehran. There followed the Clinton administration, which was schizophrenic in its own way on Iranian policy. It watched the operations by the Iranian Quds Force and Hezbollah in Lebanon, an attack on a Jewish center in Argentina, and then, most spectacularly, the attack on the Khobar Towers military compound in Saudi Arabia. And Iran, it appeared, feared that, in the eyes of the Clinton administration, that it had to go on the offense to prevent that regime change that it saw the U.S. as being interested in bringing about in Tehran. And so, understandably, the Clinton team saw a threat. It began down the road of imposing economic sanctions on Iran, which is a road that was traveled for years and years afterwards. Then the election of President Khatami in Tehran led the Clinton team to think that there was an opening, that at last perhaps there was that elusive Iranian moderate leader, that he had been found. So a kind of dialogue actually began. Some small trade avenues were opened. You'll remember pistachios and rugs, probably. And a thaw seemed to be actually, at least, if not underway, possible. But ultimately, Ayatollah Khamenei imposed a lot of conditions on that thaw, and it never really came to pass. And then George W. Bush arrived on the scene. And, tragically, the 9/11 terrorist attacks hit. And those have been discussed here some already this morning. After 9/11, actually, there was a chance. And I think perhaps the best chance since the 1979 revolution for the U.S. and Iran to actually start working together on something meaningful. In fact, the Iranians were among all the countries in the world among the most sympathetic to the U.S. after the 9/11 tragedy. Not just the Iranian people, but the Iranian government. And in fact, the Iranians engaged with the U.S. for a time as an ally in the fight against al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. The U.S. at that point could well have seen Iran as a potential long-term ally in the fight against Sunni extremism, which threatened Tehran as much as it threatened the U.S. in some ways. But as my colleague Jay Solomon wrote in his new book, which I would heartily recommend to all of you, The Iran Wars, he entitled an entire chapter on this period as, quote, the missed chance. Because the chance was missed, the opening was not really seized. Some American officials were suspicious that Iranian allies in Afghanistan were simply laying a trap for U.S. soldiers to attack them later on once the Taliban and the al-Qaeda forces were gone, much as they had taken the opportunity in Beirut years earlier to attack the U.S. And so instead of being an arm's-length ally in the war on terrorism, Iran became part of the axis of evil instead, almost the exact opposite. Then came the move against Iraq and Saddam Hussein. In this regard, I think the Bush team proceeded from the tragically mistaken belief that Saddam Hussein were toppled, Iraq's Shiites would rise to power and make Iraq the nation that eclipsed Iran as the dominant Shiite force in the region, and not one as dedicated to destabilizing its Arab neighbors. This idea, of course, turned out to be not just wrong, but completely wrong. And in fact, the reverse happened. Saddam Hussein's fall opened the way for Iran to exercise increased influence on Iraq, not the other way around, and that continues until today. And, again, tragically, many American soldiers and Marines died as a result of this miscalculation. And the U.S. has invested almost $1 trillion in trying, in the aftermath of it, to get Iraq right. And by wiping out Iran's principal regional foe, the U.S. paved the way for not only a significant expansion of Iranian influence, but a whole new round of mutual mistrust between Washington and Tehran, the exact opposite, again, of what the Bush team had calculated. Later, the Bush team did, in fact, see an opening for what it thought could be regime change in Tehran after the disputed election of President Ahmadinejad in 2005 and the public unrest that it created. I know some top Bush administration officials thought they saw the possibility there of a popular grassroots uprising that could bring about regime change, and they spent some time trying to figure out whether they could do anything to make that more likely. In fact, though, I think they never figured out a way to do that and discovered, or at least realized, that whatever they did to encourage that process would, in the end, only undermine it. And it was, in fact, put down on the streets of Tehran. So that's more or less the situation that President Obama inherited in 2009. And he, of course, took a wildly different approach from many of his predecessors. He set out from the very beginning of his term to establish a line of communication, not just with the government, but with Ayatollah Khamenei himself, and succeeded in that to some extent. The Obama team then chose not to dive in and stir the pot among the popular uprisings after the 2009 presidential election, which has been discussed here today a bit as well. And eventually it moved on to a two-track approach. The first track was to impose really strict and actually really effective economic sanctions on the Iranian economy as a way to compel the Iranians into serious negotiations over the nuclear program. And this strategy actually began bearing some fruit in 2013 with the election of President Rouhani and the emergence of Foreign Minister Zarif, two people that it turns out Washington could deal with. The final stages of this story, of course, are well known to all of you. Months and months of negotiations over the proposed Iranian nuclear deal, the successful completion of that deal, the repatriation of billions of dollars of frozen Iranian funds, and the apparent and continuing freezing of Iranian nuclear activity. There also, of course, was a giant political uproar in the U.S. over whether the deal was worth, whether the price paid was worth the reward won, whether it was a good or bad idea, and an extraordinary rupture between the leaders of the U.S. and Israel over all of those very questions, one that continued throughout the entirety of the Obama administration. And beneath it all, there was a kind of an implicit hope. That was the hope that this deal would keep Iranian nuclear ambitions at bay for a decade or so, by which time the generation of the 1979 revolution in Iran would finally have relinquished power to a new generation, one not so well rehearsed in chance of death to America, and that generation would take over and bring a different attitude to the table. This was never explicitly stated by the Obama administration, but I know for a fact it was very much the hope of President Obama. Now, of course, there's President Donald Trump. His campaign rhetoric against Iran and the nuclear deal was loud, and it was hostile. And as Karim Zajapur of the Carnegie Endowment, who's a very interesting observer of the Iranian scene these days, wrote shortly after the election, quote, "Today, much of the world perceives Iran to have a reasonable president in Hassan Rouhani, who's up for re-election in May 2017, and an urbane foreign minister in Foreign Minister Zarif, while Trump is perceived as America's Ahmadinejad." Now, that sentence was contained in a long piece in which Karim explored quite openly the possibility of the U.S. now stumbling into a war in Iran sometime, with Iran rather, in the next 4 years. So the great diplomatic opening of a few years ago has come to this in a matter of months, to the fear of out-and-out military hostilities. Now, to keep this in perspective, I think that despite Trump campaign rhetoric to the contrary, the nuclear deal has not been abrogated, and I don't think it's going to be. Instead, its biggest critics, President Trump, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, all seem to have concluded that they are all better off, for various reasons, that it remain in place than they would be if it were blown up and Iran were free to pursue a nuclear breakout strategy. Beyond that, I think the Trump team is actually still trying to figure out exactly what its Iran policy is. There's a policy review underway, and I don't think it's near completion. It probably took an interesting turn last night at an airfield in Syria, but we'll have to see how that works out. It is very likely that in conjunction with a Republican-controlled Congress, new economic sanctions will be imposed in Iran in various ways over the next year or two, not nominally because of the nuclear program, because that would basically be an abrogation of the program, but because, at least nominally, of Iranian support for terrorism and other questionable regional behavior. For its part, though, Iran has said that it would consider new sanctions for whatever reason the U.S. claims to be a violation of the nuclear agreement. So I think we'll have to see how that plays out and where the line on both sides actually is between bluster and actual real intentions. So there you, in a nutshell, have it, I think. 4 decades of tortured history, 6 straight American presidents troubled by, if not undercut by, the inability to get this relationship onto a healthier track, and a 7th president, very likely set up for more of the same. But as I noted at the outset, it all just begs the bigger question: does it have to be this way? A reasonable way to look at the U.S.-Iranian relationship, it seems to me, over this 4-decade span, is to see it as a never-ending U.S. quest to find those elusive Iranian moderate leaders. And for the Iranian government, for its part, to seek in vain some way to reassure itself that America's basic goal at the end of the day, every day, isn't to effect regime change in Tehran. These are the 2, I think, irreconcilable and conflicting views that have gotten in the way over and over and over again. This is a picture of 2 great nations talking past each other. The U.S. sees a government in Tehran that's pursuing the classic revolutionary strategy, which says that to protect a revolution, revolutionaries must always be on the offense, seeking to expand the boundaries of their revolution, to export it, to build some safe space around itself. And the Iranians see a government in Washington that will always be the ultimate counter-revolutionary force, never willing to accept the legitimacy of those who took power after the Shah, and convinced that the only secure solution in this situation is one in which those people are ultimately toppled. And in that sense, it's destined to remain really hard. For starters, Iran's enemies in the region right now are our friends. Iran's friends in the regions are our enemies, and this is an unhealthy backdrop for any kind of a good relationship, to say the least. Still, on an optimistic note, I think that the nuclear deal showed that diplomacy is possible even under these conditions. Possible now in a way that it wasn't 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And the possibilities beyond the nuclear deal are limited, but they're not non-existent. Joint mistrust of Sunni extremists is one starting point, one of the places where there are some aligned interests, and there are others. So short term, maybe there is a way for a healthier relationship to start there. But longer term, I fear that we have to wait for 2 giant forces to bring themselves to the fore and to exert themselves over this situation to have a really fundamental change in this tortured relationship. The first, I think, is the reality of the global economy. The era of economic sanctions showed that Iran isn't and can't really be distracted or divorced from the rest of the world economy. And that's going to remain true and important not only in Tehran but in Washington. And as the era of fossil fuels slowly comes to a close, that harsh reality is going to become more true for the Iranian government. And not just across this relationship, but around the world, trade and technology are blurring borders and compelling lots of odd couple relationships, and maybe that will be the case in this relationship as well. But finally, and I think long-term, the best hope for a new start is, in fact, generational change. This goes to the question you asked just a few minutes ago. The U.S. and Iran, once before the revolution in 1979, saw their strategic interests coinciding, so it can look that way. And this is not necessarily a natural state of affairs that we've been experiencing for the last 40 years, but maybe those different realities can only be seen when both countries are run by a new generation of leaders, younger, tech-savvy Americans and Iranians who can't understand how two great and learned societies fell so far out of favor with each other, and who don't see religion as a barrier, but as simply another fact of life. A generation that doesn't remember all that I've recounted here this morning quite so clearly as we all do. You know, my formative impressions of Iran, let's face it, were in many ways formed by Ted Koppel on Nightline with pictures of the hostages in the embassy. So maybe what these two countries need are people who either have forgotten those images or, more likely, who never had them in their minds in the first place. Thank you all very much for the chance to be here.
Who'd like to ask the first question? In the back there?
Hi, thank you for coming today.
Sure.
And I had a question. So you were speaking to generational change and how Iranians would forget or never know those images from the revolution. Now, my question is, you know, as the entire region ages, as they reach, you know, age 50, 60, 70, I mean, well beyond even my own lifetime, how's that going to affect the state of Iran? I mean, I highly doubt they're prepared to have so many elderly people in their care in that country. And I as a, you know, American, I might be a little bit more gifted in that respect, but I'm worried that it might challenge the effectiveness of the states in the Middle East as they stand currently.
Well, look, I mean, this was discussed briefly earlier this morning. I mean, the demographics of the region are just startling, if not stunning, and that's true of Iran as well. I mean, the generational imbalance, the share of the population that's below, say, 25 years of age, certainly 30 years of age, in many of these countries, including Egypt, where I used to live, and including Iran, is very striking. And so that's both a problem and an opportunity, it seems to me. The problem is the one you just described. The opportunity is that, I mean, the problem being essentially they got to have economies that produce jobs for all these young people, and the opportunity to basically take part in a global economy that they can see out there, but that they maybe feel is beyond their reach right now. That's the problem. The opportunity is fresh eyes, and I think particularly in this relationship between Tehran and Washington, fresh eyes got to be better than the tired old eyes, right? I mean, it just seems there are possibilities that entrenched older people in this relationship can't really seem to see or realize. And so, you know, I think this is true across the region. It's why it's going to be, you know, the lines, both literal border lines and the kind of the lines of alliances in the region, I think are all open, subject for reconsideration over the next 10 to 20 years. And it's for a lot of reasons, but I think the demographic reason is a huge one in every country I can think of in the region. I mean, look at the numbers sometime. They're really striking.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Over here. John Duke Anthony.
John Duke Anthony. I'm intrigued by the last remark. I wish it was the case, or would that it be the case, that the younger generation that did not experience 40 years ago will be better than that particular generation when that generation passes. Certainly not the case with Armenians. The younger, even third generation is just as emotional, empathetic, and angry, in cases militant, as the older generation. Ditto with the Palestinians, who as militant and angry and emotional as the older generation. Ditto to a degree with the Taiwanese there, who are not about to give up, give in, and surrender what they feel to be their natural rights. So I don't think the case studies support that thesis. Golly, I wish they did. Secondly, that no one has
He's just
mentioned
taken away
the
my
vested interest.
one optimistic note, and he's just knocked it completely off.
Yeah. I wish you were the case. I pray that it were the case. God bless if it is the case.
Yeah.
But I don't see the examples out there as supportive of that. And the second point is no one has mentioned the economic stake of the Iran Revolutionary Guard in the country's economy. My goodness. The National Assembly and Rouhani's followers have passed budgets after budgets after budgets to fix the roads, the bridges, the tunnels, and the Iran Revolutionary Guard, after 12 years of those budgets, haven't moved an inch.
Yeah.
They have an enormous stake in the economy. So do the besieged and the orphans and the widows of the Iran-Iraq war. I don't see them budging. Would that they would.
Yeah.
But I don't see them budget. They have an enormous stake, sort of like the Egyptian army or military has an enormous stake in Egypt's economy. Vested interest there have their own way of not budging.
Right. Well, those are both two extremely good, valid points. I guess in response to the first, I would just say that you could at least point to what you saw in the streets of Tehran in 2005 and 2009 as a sign that this younger generation in this particular place hasn't entirely bought in, and it may not be, more adamant than their elders about the way the relationship has evolved with the U.S. I mean, that's the only evidence I could point to, but I think it is meaningful evidence. You're absolutely right about the Revolutionary Guards and the economy, and this is one of the reasons that, when people say, and I think they're right, that economic sanctions work against the Iranians, they have worked by crippling the economy, but they've probably also worked by basically simply strengthening the hold the Revolutionary Guards have over the economy in Iran. And that's the classic law of unintended consequences, and it's one of the reasons to wonder about whether more and more sanctions can actually produce, in the end, the results that you want. But I think if you're a U.S. policymaker, you are stuck with a lack of really good tools in the toolkit, and this one happens to be the one that's worked the best.
Jerry, I'm going to take the chair's privilege just to ask a question I know a lot of people would want to know your answer to. You're one of our keenest observers of Washington politics, too. And so you mentioned a little bit about the Trump administration's efforts to wrestle with the history of Iran policy, the nuclear deal, contemporary events in Syria, and so forth. Let me pose the question this way. One version of this analysis would be that you've got the kind of reassertion of the foreign policy establishment with people like General Mattis, General McMaster, and that one might expect a kind of return to the alliance structures in the Gulf and more generally the strategy that had been adopted by previous administrations. The other view is that there's very great turbulence here, right? There are actors who are new on the scene, Steve Bannon being an obvious case, but Jared Kushner, too, from a different point of view, who do apparently exercise a fair amount of influence, plus the kind of whiplash from an ostensibly pro-Russia, Assad, at least rhetoric, to one quite the opposite. So is your read, I mean, we're now at war again, or even more so, is this a dangerous moment, or do you think things are kind of going to go back to some tracks we're familiar with?
Well, look, I think in a lot of ways, more on international policy than domestic policy, things have reverted at least a little bit closer to the norm in the last 2 months. Think about what happened last night. Which Donald Trump persona was going to come to the fore, the America First neo-isolationist Donald Trump, or the one that said, I'm going to use American power to clean up these messes that Obama left lingering? I mean, those are two diametrically opposed messages, and they were coexistent throughout the campaign. What we saw last night was that, contrary to what a lot of people expected, and by the way, there's a lot of conservative unhappiness about this morning, that the assertive, yes, I am willing to get involved, in Syria, Donald Trump stepped to the fore. I mean, who knew? The embassy in Israel has not been moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The 35% tariff on Chinese imports has not been imposed. The declaration that China is a foreign currency manipulator has not been declared on the first day. The idea that we were going to withdraw from NATO, I mean, there's been this flood of American officials rushing to Brussels and elsewhere to tell people that's not going to be the case. And the president stood with the Prime Minister of Japan within 2 weeks of taking office and saying, I stand 100% behind Japan when it comes to confronting the North Koreans. So there is, I would argue, a kind of a reversion at least closer to the norm on some foreign policy things. Look, it's a Trump administration. It will never be entirely normal, what any of us would think of as normal. But I think in this area, you know, let's face it, the world has a way of sobering up a leader when he walks through those doors at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And you have in General Mattis and General McMaster, and I think even to some extent with Rex Tillerson, a kind of more traditional thinkers moving to the forefront. And I think we're seeing some of the consequences of that, you know. And to go to the point that we're talking about here, the Iran deal has not been abrogated. They are not talking about abrogating it. And so, you know, a very top Trump administration official, I should probably not name, said to me the other day, he said, thank God that there's no law in this country that says people have to govern the way they campaign.
And on that very optimistic note, unfortunately, Jerry does have to run up to, there are things happening in D.C. I lied earlier. He really has to hit the road. But before you go, we have a little gift for you.
Oh, thank you.
It's just to remember the Reeve Center by and Jim
Thank
Bell.
you very much. And I just would want to say just one last note. I mean, Jim Bill really was a national treasure, and I know you all appreciate it, but I just want to underscore that again. I mean, there's a reason we're all here today, and it's a really, really good reason, and I appreciate being invited. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
So